Okay, so we are going to now lay out our roof rafters. But before that, we're gonna need a few pieces of information to be able to calculate all the numbers that we need. So the first thing that we're gonna need is what's called the total span of the building. And that is gonna be from the outside of one wall to the outside of the other wall. And it's important to remember, we're gonna wanna have our roof rafters on the outside of our wall sheathing. So we need to take into account that thickness. So if you remember, our wall was 8 feet long on this corner here. Our gable is gonna be on the end. So we're gonna do 8 feet plus the thickness of one sheet, which is 7/16. So 8 feet, 7/16, plus the thickness of this other sheet of wall sheathing over here, which is another 7/16. So 7/16 and 7/16 equals 7/8. So that we can write down on a scrap piece of wood here. We have 8 foot, 7/16 of an inch for our total span. That number is important because the number that we need for a rafter, or figuring out our rafter length, is our total run. And the total run means from the start point to the finish point of how far that rafter is gonna run along the building. So our total run is actually exactly half of what we have for our wall. And I just realized I made a little mistake here. It's 8 foot 7/8 is what we came out to, not 7/16. So half of this number, which is our total run, is gonna be 4 foot 7/16 of an inch. And I've done a little math here for us so we can follow along here. This is gonna be all the math that we do. So like I said, total span, 8 foot 7/8. Our total run now is gonna be 4 foot 7/16. That's half of our span. So in order to do this, we need to convert our 4 foot 7/16 of an inch into decimals. So the first thing we're gonna do, we have our inches. So we need to convert that. 7 divided by 16 is 0.4375 inches, if you will. So we know we have 0.4375 inches. We need to convert that to feet. So we're gonna divide that by 12, and we have 0.0365. So we have 4 feet, 0.0365. And that's gonna be our total run here. So we have our total run here, and the next thing we're gonna wanna do is we'll grab a framing square here, and there's a lot of important information on a good framing square. So we know that our total run is 4.0365 feet, and what we wanna do is figure out what the hypotenuse of our triangle that we're making. So if you kinda think about it here, we have our wall, and we have our total run, and we're gonna make a rafter. So this measurement right here is that 4.0365. We're making a right triangle, and we're trying to find what this hypotenuse is. The people who make rafter squares are pretty nice to us, and they have all these numbers laid out here. So this one's pretty light, but there's a lot of different information on here. This first line on here, I don't think you're gonna be able to see it, but it's a common rafter length per foot of run. That's exactly what we're trying to figure out here. So for every foot that we come, we're trying to figure out how far that hypotenuse is. For this roof, we're gonna do a 12-12 pitch. That means for every 12 inches of run, we're gonna have 12 inches of rise. So we'll come to this 12-inch mark here, and we can see that our hypotenuse is 16.97. So that's the number that we're looking for. So I've written that down here. We have a 12-12 roof, and our hypotenuse is 16.97. So we'll put the framing square down for a few seconds. And what we're gonna do with that number is we're gonna take that total run that we just figured out, and we're going to multiply that by 16.97. And that comes out to be 68.498, which is pretty close to 68.5 inches. And that's gonna be our theoretical rafter length. And I'll talk about what theoretical means here in a minute, but that's the important number that we need. So what we're gonna do here is we're actually gonna pause, and I'm gonna show you guys basically what all the numbers on a rafter or a speed square mean. We basically have 4 different pieces of information. On this long hypotenuse part of the triangle, we have degrees. On this side, we have basically a common ruler. And then we have this bar here. We have 2 pieces of information. On this bar here, we have common angles for rafters, and on this one we have basically a hip angle. So this bottom is what we typically use the most. That is that 12 base number, so we have a 12-12. Your roofs typically are on a scale of 12. So we have a 4-12, a 5-12, a 12-12 in our case. So that means like if we had a 4-12 roof, for every 12 inches we'd go up 4 inches. This is just that number, and we're going to show you how to read that on a board here in a second. But we need to really focus on using this common scale and not the hip scale, because the hip has a different base number and that's a 17. So we always want to use the 12 base. So how we use this, again, we're going to use that common rafter line here. We'll get a pencil. We want a good sharp pencil for this. Rafter layout is one of those things that you really want to take your time and be as accurate as possible. So having a sharp pencil and a good crisp line really pays off when you go to cut the rafter out. So, got a sharp pencil. Now there's one more important part to a rafter square, and that's this pivot point. That's, you have a good long fence here. That way you can hold that against the board and you know that this is exactly perpendicular, this edge. And this edge is actually at a 45-degree angle. So what we want to do is we want to hold at a pivot point right here, and we can now pivot this, this speed square along that pivot point. And what we're going to do is we're going to read our common line here, and we know that we have a 12-12 pitch to our roof, so we'll pivot, and we'll pivot till we can read this number right at 12. So when you're reading a rafter here, it's really important to be looking straight down on your speed square, because if you hold here and you're looking back, you're actually looking at a different angle and can be off just a little bit. So you want to sight straight down your board, making sure you're tight with your pivot point, and you're going to read the 12 mark, line that up with the edge of your board, and now you have on this line here the pitch of your roof. So we'll lay that out and we'll actually extend that this whole board here. And now when we cut this piece off, this will be perpendicular to the ground, and our board will be at a 45-degree angle, which is the pitch of our roof, or a 12-12 pitch. So this is going to be our theoretical peak. And what I mean by theoretical peak is we actually have a ridge board at the top. So our ridge board is going to sit in here just like this, and our ridge board material is going to be a 2x8. This is just a scrap piece, but we'll actually be using a 2x8. But the important information that we want to know is the thickness of our ridge board. So we're going to be using a 2x material. This point that we just drew is the theoretical point, meaning when we match another rafter coming up here, that means from this very point here down to the edge of our roof is going to be that 68.5. But we need to account for the thickness of our ridge board here, which is 1.5 inches. So we're going to take off 3/4 inch on this one and 3/4 inch on the side that comes up and butts up into this one. 3/4 and 3/4 is 1.5 inches, which is the thickness of our board. So the way that we do that is we'll take a speed square here, and we don't want to measure 3/4 along this edge. We want to make sure that we're nice and perpendicular to our line here, and take 3/4 inch off perpendicular to that line. So now we do that because we're actually thinking if our rafter was in place, we'd be at an angle, and we want to make that line plumb to the ground. If we went along this edge here and we actually went 3/4 inch and drew a line, we'd actually be about an 1/8 inch off of what we're actually trying to take, and it wouldn't be as accurate. So make sure when you're taking that measurement, you're going perpendicular to the line. And we're gonna draw a new line here. All right, so we have this theoretical line, and we're gonna take all of our measurements off this theoretical line, but this is actually gonna be our cut line. And again, that's accounting for that thickness of our ridge beam. So what we're gonna do next is we're gonna take that 68.5 inch measurement that we came up with our math, and we're gonna come down this rafter. And what I like to do, it's kind of like the same concept of burning an inch with our framing. We're gonna burn an inch with our tape measure here. It's much more accurate. And like I said, the more accurate we are with the rafter layout, the better the roof's gonna come out. So what we wanna do is we wanna transfer that point, our theoretical point, to the side, and we're gonna hold right on the edge. Gonna hold at 1 inch, and we're gonna come all the way down here to 68.5. AJ will make sure we're nice and tight. And we're gonna come down 68.5 inches. So we really wanna focus on making sure we're right along the edge of the board. We don't wanna come down here and measure 68.5. Everything's gonna be measured on the edge of the board. So AJ, you're still at 1 inch. Mm-hmm. Perfect. So we're gonna do that 68.5, but remember we burned an inch down there. So we're gonna add that inch back on down here. So just to double check, you wanna hold the tape? All right, so we actually have that 68.5 inches. So what we're gonna do now, our plumb cut, this is the cut that's basically gonna be on the side of the wall. So again, we came over here and we had that angle pointing this way. We're gonna keep that same angle and move it down here to that 68.5 inch mark. So this is our pivot point. And again, this is why we measured on the edge of the board, so we know exactly where our pivot point is. Gonna put our speed square right on that point, and we're gonna go to our 12-12 pitch again. So we'll slide it up, making sure we're reading that common line, sight straight down the board, and make another mark here. Okay. So now we know that from the point, our cut line here, this is where our ridge board is going to meet up. We'll come all the way down, and we come straight down. This is actually going to be the outside of that sheathing of the wall. So now we need to make what's called a bird's mouth, and that's basically going to be a perpendicular line to this cut. We're going to cut out a triangle. So when we actually put this rafter up into place, it'll have a nice flat spot to sit on the wall. And they just call it a bird's mouth. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a speed square here, and we're gonna run it right along the edge of this line using our fence here. And we're gonna actually read this, this common ruler here. And we're gonna take the width of our top plate. We've used 2x4 material for our top plate. And we're gonna add that 7/16 of an inch for our sheathing. And we're gonna come out with 3 inches and 15 16ths. So we'll run up until we have that 3 inches and 15 16ths. Now, my speed square only has ace, but you can eyeball that that measurement there. All right, and then we're gonna make that square cut here and make this line nice and straight. So now you can see we have that 3 inches and 15 16ths, and that will be, make sure we have enough bearing, that whole top plate of that wall, for us to be able to screw and nail into. All right, so this is gonna be cut out, and again, we're gonna cut out our top of our rafter here, but we have one more thing to lay out, and that's gonna be our overhang. So for this building, we're gonna do a 1 foot overhang, and the easiest way to do that, if you can imagine, this is our wall. we're gonna have exactly 1 foot overhanging here. So we're not actually going to measure 12 inches. We're gonna use that hypotenuse again, because again, for every 1 foot we travel, we have that hypotenuse of 16.97. And that's pretty darn close to 17 inches. So what we're gonna do is we're actually just gonna come down here 17 inches and make a mark. Oop, again, I burned an inch, so we need to go to 18 here. So we have 17 there. We're gonna make another plumb cut, again going the same direction, the same angle as all of our other cuts. Hold at the pivot point, sight straight down, hold at 12-12, and we're gonna make a line. Finish that line out. And again, this is another theoretical line, if you will. So with our finish, we're actually gonna have a 2x6 fascia board on the end of this. So what we'll do is, just like we accounted for that ridge board at top, we're gonna account for the thickness of the fascia here, except we're gonna take off the whole width of that fascia because we're not butting anything up to it. So our fascia is 2x material. So 2x material is 1.5 inches. So we're gonna take a perpendicular measurement here. Let's just use a tape measure. And we're gonna come back 1.5 inches. Measure both sides, 1.5 inches. And now this is gonna be our cut line. So we'll come here, connect the points. That was just a theoretical line. This is gonna be our cut line. So now we have a completely laid out rafter. We'll cut here, we'll cut out our bird's mouth, and we'll cut our plumb line up at the top. Okay, so we have our rafter laid out, so we're gonna get ready to cut it. And the first thing that we want to do, it's a good idea. Your chop saw or your circular saw has probably been used all day out on the job site. So it's a good idea just to check that your blade is square. We're actually out of square a little bit. It's a good thing we checked. Again, with rafters, the more accurate you can be, the easier it's gonna be to actually frame it. So want to make sure all of our cuts are square and as straight as possible. All right, again, whenever we're working near the blade, make sure that your saw is unplugged. So we'll plug it back in and we'll get ready for some cuts. All right. So again, we had that theoretical line. That was just for our measurements. We're gonna go on our cut line here and making sure that we cut on the left side of the line. If you look at a saw blade, it's got about a 1/16 to an 1/8 inch thickness. So if you cut on the opposite side of the line, you would actually be taking off more material than you're actually meaning to. So make sure that you know which side of the line you're cutting on. Whenever you're doing an angle cut, it's a good idea to hold the guard out of the way. But when you do that, just make sure you have your thumb holding the guard and your other fingers are gonna be on this little holder here. Then you know that all your fingers are out of the way. So we'll make this cut. And then we'll come back here. Now we're gonna cut this bird's mouth out. Again, making sure that our blade is on this side of both of these lines, but we're also not gonna make a cut all the way past here. We are taking this triangle out, but what we'll do is just cut up to this point here and then come back and cut to this point. And the reason why we do that is this blade is circular. So we're cutting material at the top, but we're not quite making it there on the bottom. But we don't want to go past this line to get this chunk out. We'll actually come back with a handsaw and finish that cut to get that material out. All right, so what we can do, where'd my handsaw go? Oh, here it is. All right, we'll just take a handsaw. You can use a Sawzall if you want to. I prefer a handsaw just because it has a nice flat surface to reference your cut line, and it just makes cleanup just a little bit easier. Finish that cut. All right, so now if we flip this up, we have a nice crisp corner. I can do a little final cleanup if you need to. And now this part will now sit on top of that wall once it's put into place. All right, so we have one final cut here. All right, now we have a completely laid out rafter. So for our project, we have 5 layout lines every 2 feet. So we're gonna need a total of 10 rafters, and we'll get those cut. Okay, so we got all of our rafters cut out. We made 10 total. But now what we need to do, 4 more boards, and those are gonna be our fly rafters. And what a fly rafter is basically we have our common rafters that starts at the edge of the wall. We actually have a overhang on our gable wall as well. So we're gonna do a very similar cut. We don't need to do any more math because we actually have it all laid out for us with these common rafters. The only difference being is we're not gonna cut a bird's mouth. This fly rafter is basically gonna act as our fascia for our gable walls. So I'm gonna show you guys a little trick here. You only have to lay out one rafter when you're doing rafter layout, and you can actually use that same rafter to trace all of your other ones. The biggest thing to remember when doing that though is to always take the one that you marked out with your math, write template on it, and always use that same board or your same rafter to mark out all the other ones. What's gonna happen if you don't do that? If you basically use your first one, mark out the next one, put this one in a pile, cut this one, and keep changing your template, you're actually gonna keep growing a little bit and your rafters are gonna change size. So it's always good to use your same template throughout the whole process. So what you'll do to do that is you'll just lay it right on top of the other one and make sure you're nice and flush on this edge. Come down here. Check that you're flush down here. And you also really want to try to choose your straightest lumber when doing your rafters. It makes this process a lot easier. So all right, we're nice and flush. And this is where it really pays to use a sharp pencil. So even if it looks pretty sharp, put a nice point on it and try to get as crisp of a line as possible. And you also want to really take your time cutting your first board, making sure that you have a nice straight cut, because then you're going to trace this and you want a nice straight surface to trace with and not a bumpy one. So it gives you a nice crisp line. All right, so we'll hold the board and we'll trace our plumb cut here. This is our fly rafter, so again, we're not going to trace our bird's mouth, but if you were marking out your rafters, you would trace out your bird's mouth. And then we'll trace out our line down here. I don't think I got it on the last video, but if you notice, I have a little notch cut off here. That notch, when we use our 2x6 fascia here, we're gonna sight down here. That's where our 2x6 fascia is gonna go. We just took that little notch off because it's actually gonna stick further down from where we want it to. That's gonna get in the way of when we do our soft fit finish. So we just take that off now and be done with it. So, all right, so we got this all laid out. We have nice crisp lines. I'm actually gonna extend this one just so it helps us to cut a little bit. We'll make 2 cuts on that one and we'll cut out our fly rafter.